Yeah, too late.
I suspect it.
No,
sometimes it's quite good to have a slightly different take and see what's going on.
And we, of course, go very deep into one country.
I'm not talking about
Well, yeah.
mine's much more superficial.
Yeah, I know. I read the paper back in the day. But we'll see how it goes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our conference will begin in approximately 3 minutes. If you could begin taking your seats at this time, would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome. Yes, thank you, David. Welcome to this meeting, sponsored by the EFDD Group, the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy. Of course, direct democracy is the reason that Brexit happened. Had our politicians kept power over this issue, we could never, ever, ever be en route 6 months from now to leaving the European Union, although maybe our Prime Minister up at the summit this evening will do our best to make sure that isn't actually the case, but it will be. One of the things that I've done in the 20 years that I've been here is to advance arguments that weren't universally popular within the European institutions, namely to take on the status quo, the fixed, settled view that existed across the United Kingdom that we were members of the European Union and that only the mad and bad would even contemplate a different future. But it's a funny thing, you know. When you speak the unspeakable, people begin to think the unthinkable. And so it was with Brexit. Now, I won't pretend that it wasn't difficult. I won't pretend that it didn't. I've got to sit for the camera, my God. I normally stand for the camera, but there we are. And that's what we managed to do. Brexit was made easier by one very fundamental decision that we didn't take, namely to join the euro. We had this great debate at the turn of the century, and I'm very pleased to say we didn't do it. I'm under no illusions that if we had joined the euro, leaving the European Union would have been a harder debate. And when I see what's going on around the rest of Europe, namely, have you seen today's opinion poll in Italy, where now 56% of Italians want to leave the European Union because they want to be a sovereign, self-governing nation. But the problem Italian politicians will have when talking about leaving the European Union is how to leave the euro. And that is why this conference that is taking place here today, deep in the belly of the beast of the European institutions, we are heretics in the middle of a temple, but that's why this debate is so fundamentally important, because the big advantage that the other side have is they have the status quo. They had it with European Union membership, and they will have it as this debate goes on with the euro. You've got a series of economists going to speak to you this afternoon, and my guess is they will speak to you fundamentally about economics. But remember this as an underlay. The euro, when it was put together, was not done so for economic reasons. It was done so for political reasons. Because in the Commission, and amongst the minds of the Kohls and Mitterrands and Delors and people of that day, they believed that if you put together an economic and monetary union, political union would follow as sure as night follows day. So from the very beginning, it was a political project. From what I can see, it has wrought endless misery on many countries, particularly in the Mediterranean, and it is a huge barrier to any country that wants to be a genuinely free, independent, self-governing state. So for our visitors, those of us in the Eurosceptic groups here who are considered to be anti-European, I think in many ways, in fact, we are the most pro-European people inside these institutions, because we recognise that what makes Europe a fabulous, fascinating, indeed in many ways the greatest continent on earth, is that we've got different nationalities with different languages, different cultures, different wines, different cheeses, and after this conference, different currencies too. Because without your own currency, you can't be a self-governing, democratic, independent nation. So I welcome all of you to these proceedings. I will not be able to stay with you for all of it. There is a little matter of a British Prime Minister turning up at a summit just up the road in an hour's time. But I wish all well for this afternoon. And I hope we get some debate that starts to advance the argument. People say staying part of the euro is inevitable. There is nothing that can be done. There is no counter-argument. Let that intellectual debate and political debate begin in this room this very afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nigel, for the welcoming words. We go on by two opening remarks. The first of Jiří Payne from Czech Republic.
Guten Nachmittag. Ich werde Deutsch sprechen, ja. Eigentlich, wir sind glücklich.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. We're actually delighted that we don't have the euro. Our people are very firmly against. That's an advantage for the Czech Republic. At the start, let me comment on Bernard Connolly from the UK. He works for the Commission. He was responsible for the currency policy. In 1995, he wrote a book. He actually criticized the project. He said that it would never work. And therefore, he was dismissed from service in the Commission. And I'm mentioning that because right from the start, it was clear it would never work. And I think that's very important. This was clear right from the start. In the Czech Republic, we have twice experienced leaving a currency. For the first time after the First World War in 1918, the Austrian currency was collapsing. Alex Rushin, our first finance minister, in fact, had prepared a plan. He was in prison at the time. His idea was that he would put some kind of stamp on the banknotes to show that the money in the new Czechoslovakia was different to the Austrian currency. Now, of course, there could have been speculation, so that's why you cannot let anyone know beforehand. It's got to have the surprise effect. Nevertheless, he got a vote in the parliament. He was able to pursue it. It was very successful. In a few years, the Czech currency became this leading currency in Europe. So I can say that was a very well-prepared step that he undertook, and it worked. And then the second occasion that we were able to leave a currency was when Czechoslovakia split. We were inspired by this earlier example. And of course, there's got to be a surprise effect again. And in fact, there was still some speculation, but the impact wasn't too dramatic. So, as I said, the second time we were able to leave a currency successfully, we did it economically in line with the political developments as well, and the split of Czechoslovakia. It was successful. There were no disasters. The whole thing was done very smoothly, and it worked. And today, I think this is very important. With the split in Czechoslovakia, we'd established some priorities. The most important priority was that 20 years down the line, we wanted to have very good relations with Slovakia. We wanted to continue to coexist, to live together, and to be able to carry out the split in such a way that we can remain friends. And I can say it was successful. We are friends. We have excellent relations. And I think that's very important. And I think when we're talking about Brexit, I think that's what's so bad at the moment, that the Commission isn't thinking about the future. The Commission isn't thinking about what's going to happen 20 years down the line in terms of the relationship between the EU and the UK. That's much more important than the current situation. It's very important to have long-term prospects for good relations. Now, technically speaking, splitting up a currency or leaving is not so difficult. There's a plan, there's a procedure. But the hardest thing is the political decision. So that's our task as politicians, when it's necessary, to explain to the people that this is a step that they don't have to be afraid of. It can happen very smoothly, it can be successful, and it's never as difficult as you might imagine if you're looking from the outside. It's not a disaster.
Well, let me start with a few personal remarks to Nigel and Jiri, and after that I come to my topics. Dear Nigel, thank you very much for welcoming everybody to our conference. You have achieved something that most people thought was impossible. What you did is indeed a masterstroke of political campaigning. You have written and rewritten history by taking back your country. The referendum on Brexit is the most democratic decision ever taken, not only in the UK, but in all of Europe. Brexit is now entering its critical phase. We are just about to finally learn about the value of democratic decision-making in the EU. Let me say, I really keep my fingers crossed for you and for your country.
Thank you.
Today we want to build the foundation for a similar thing. In the past years, we have repeatedly seen how the establishment has been doing everything to prevent Greece from exiting the Eurozone. Over and over, we have been told the euro is irreversible. We have been told that now that we have the euro, we can never go back. Ladies and gentlemen, this I do not believe. Today we want to show that leaving the Eurozone, that is the topic of what we are talking about today, that leaving the Eurozone is still possible. Even more, we want to show how it could be done. Nigel has taken back his country. We want to take back our currency. Lieber Giri, ich setze jetzt in Deutsch fort, weil du auch in Deutsch gesprochen hast. Du warst dabei.
I'm going to continue in German. You spoke in German. Now, you were there when a country split peacefully. You said that the case was for a country that shared a currency and the economy was very closely connected. Now, I'm delighted to now make a short introduction to our topic. No one in the European Parliament has better experience than you had from the Czech Republic and the Slovaks, of course. So we're very grateful to what you said to remind us of what is feasible. And I'm even more grateful because I know that at the weekend you're going to be holding a major conference in Prague, and I wish you all the very best. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have any plans yet for the weekend, then go to Prague, because I think there's going to be some important things happening there. Jerry's going to be laying the foundation for an alliance to build a better Europe, and I think we've got to cross our fingers. Nigel, Jerry.
Urgent things to attend to. Thank you so much to both of you for supporting this conference. Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, today we don't just have a full program ahead of us, but a new program. In the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about all the problems of the euro and how we can clean up the Eurozone and how we can try to correct the mistakes of the euro. But today we want to discuss something else. We are starting with a simple but very realistic assumption. The Eurozone will collapse. It will collapse because every currency union so far has collapsed. So we have a very simple choice. Are we prepared for this or not? If we're not prepared for this, then there's going to be a chaotic breakdown of the euro. That would mean chaos. No one wants chaos. And if we don't want chaos, then it means you have to prepare for the worst case scenario. You've got to take precautions. And that's what we want to do today. We've got to reflect about how we can have an ordered dismantling of a currency, common currency. Now, of course, it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend it is. On the contrary, though, the task world ahead of us is going to be really difficult. But it's very important to face difficulties with a plan rather than going into it without any plan at all. So today we want to look at different perspectives to get prepared for this kind of solution. Roger Bootle showed at the peak of the crisis how a recipient country can leave the euro, but none of the southern countries actually left. So I'm quite keen to hear today whether we're going to learn anything about the rules for a northern country. For example, Finland. I think we're going to hear from the speaker later on. Now, the study, which he drew up with others, Fix It, I very much like that title. The idea that Finland can repair the mistakes by leaving the euro. The view from the outside of the euro is very important. So we're going to hear about the central bank as well. We're going to hear from our Czech colleague as well. Of course, he can look from the outside in a very comfortable position at this disaster in the making, the euro. Ladies and gentlemen, the Danes are also in this comfortable position. Formally speaking, the Danes are not in the euro and they've kept the krona. However, that's deceptive because the Danish krona is closely connected to the euro. Lars Christensen, what we could say is that Denmark has a so-called euro light. The end of the pegging of the currency is almost like leaving the euro, even though legally it's not so difficult. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Beck at the end. He's an expert in European law. All I can say beforehand is that if you thought that a country can only leave the euro if it also leaves the EU, then Dr. Beck has got news for you. because on the one hand, in 2011, everyone's been repeating the same kind of fake news. But Dr. Beck, I think, has come up with a legal gem, and I'm sure that you're going to be able to make use of it. And later, after we've heard from the experts, we're going to have a podium discussion to look into it. From Nigel's success story, we've realized that theory is useless if it isn't then translated into practice, a political practice. That's why this conference is going to focus on practice. What do we need to expect? What can we do? What are the steps we can already undertake, and what do we have to do later? And in particular, what we do have to discuss is how we're going to have a successful campaign, both at national level and also a cross-border campaign. I'm sure you've realized that this conference is being organized by the EFDD, but on the podium you're also going to see people from the ECR and ALDE. I'm quite sure that in the House there are skeptics from all groups who do not believe that the euro is irreversible. This conference is also about trying to create networks from other groups as well. We also want to go beyond Brussels into the national parliaments with our networks. And I think we can see that is the case with who's in the podium. We need to continue this cooperation after the conference as well. On the 20th, in 2019 at the latest, we'll have to act, because in the new parliament, there's going to be ever more Eurosceptics who don't want a federal Europe. We expect a change of a huge magnitude. Ladies and gentlemen, the euro has failed. A currency that has to be rescued on an ongoing basis is not a proper currency. This currency, first of all, is rescued by the ESM, and secondly, the European Central Bank. The rescuing or bailout from the ESM is generally funded by the countries from the north, from their budgets. There is supposedly a veto right. The governing council of the ESM is done on an unanimous basis. Now, however, if any country doesn't want that to happen, then there's no more wealth transfer taking place from the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. You might think that's okay. If there's no adoption of a new bailout, no new liability, if there's no new liability, then no bailout clause applies. However, that's not the whole story. That would be the case if the ECB were not taking it on itself against the treaties to decide to save the whole of the euro area. In other words, if the ESM, in the case of a new sovereign crisis, does not kick in, the ECB will do it, according to Draghi's whatever it takes. The ECB would do whatever it can to stop the Eurozone from collapsing. The ECB has declared that it's prepared to do anything that it can, and has thereby appropriated new powers for itself. However, it is not legitimate for it to act like that. It's politically not legitimate because the EU membership or the euro membership is done through a treaty. Secondly, the ECB is not subject to democratic or political scrutiny in its monetary policy. I have to mention also that the EU has accepted the ECB's revolutionary action. That's very interesting. So for the member states, there's no possibility to defend themselves from the ECB. In the ECB Governing Council, decisions are taken by a majority. So the member states can only then have one option. They have to be able to threaten to leave the euro if they consider their interests are no longer being served there. Robert Hirschman, an American economist, has written an excellent book, Exit, Voice and Loyalty. Basically, according to that, there are three possibilities if you're unhappy with an organization. First of all, you can accept the situation and show loyalty. Secondly, you can express your protest through elections, letters, or votes, so that's voice. Thirdly, you can move to another supplier or another state, that's exit. Now, I want to give the example of Germany and the ECB to illustrate these three possibilities. First of all, with the voting rights in the ECB, it isn't possible to have a vote to express protest. The second option, loyalty, is the one that in Germany has maintained too long. Germany has come to terms with the ECB's policy. It has no hope anymore. Maybe it's not bothered. The German government is boycotting or preventing any legal actions against the ECB. But I don't think that is sustainable. As older Germans, we grew up with a stability policy of the ECB through our grandparents as well. We learnt that stable currency is a German narrative, and it isn't possible to keep acting against that. The more the ECB goes into monetary funding, and it's already very deeply in that, I think public opinion is going to turn in Germany. So today, here in Brussels, we need to think about the third option. We want to explore the possibility of exit because that is the only possibility to actually circumvent the ECB's poor performance. We need to have exit as a real possibility because that's the only way that it's going to be possible to exert a real discipline. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes I find it strange. The South says that Germany has profited at its cost of the euro. From the North, you hear that the South is actually allowing the North to support it. But let's facts speak for themselves, or put your money where your mouth is, as the English say. If the South feels exploited, it should have the possibility to leave the Eurozone. But the same applies for everyone. We should say that the North should have the possibility to leave. We're going to see what happens as soon as we've looked at the legal, economic and political basis for an exit and established that. Ladies and gentlemen, today we want to start thinking about these foundations. For the minutes, let me say that we're going to have a small coffee break later at about 4:30, and this is being web streamed. Now, I'm sure that in Germany people will be listening. I'd like to ask you to make use of social media. We've got a hashtag, leaving the euro, and you can see it at the front here. Thank you very much for your attention. We can now hear from our experts, starting off with the first presentation.
You have gained quite a lot of recognition when, in 2012, you and your team won the Wolfson Economics Prize on the best plan, how a member state could leave the Eurozone. Back then, we are talking about the southern member states. 6 years later, the situation is quite different. I'm looking forward to what you have to say about it, Mr. Bootle. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to talk about this fascinating subject. I should say, by the way, it's almost as difficult for an outsider to get into this building as it is for an insider country to get out of the EU. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about a variety of things, and I'm going to be showing you a series of charts I think help to illustrate the issue. First of all, I want to say something about the euro fundamentals. This isn't idle because I think it goes right to the question of how and why a country should leave, and indeed which country should leave. Has the euro been a success? Has there been convergence? I'll touch on how things have changed since 2012. 2012 not only being a crisis year, but the year, as you've just heard, that my firm won the Wolfson Prize. The case for Germany to leave, and lastly, how Italy could leave, and then, unsurprisingly, a few conclusions. So, the next slide, please. Now, this chart shows what's happened to GDP in a variety of countries going back to 1999. You haven't got to worry about the absolute levels. It's all about the changes. And this goes to the question, has the euro been a success? I suspect in this building and in this city in general, people just don't know the facts. And here are the facts. Now let's go back as to what the euro was supposed to do. The euro was supposed to bring a wave of prosperity across the continent as people could suddenly compare the price of pizzas in different countries without use of a calculator. They wouldn't have to endure the depredations of currency fluctuations and currency risk. And woe betide you as a country if you stood outside the euro, as the UK did. Well, here we have the facts. The Eurozone is there in blue. Japan is red. Canada is the top of the bunch in yellow, then comes the United States, and there comes the dear old UK. So somehow or other, outside the euro, the UK has managed massively to outperform the Eurozone over this period since the euro was formed. Funny that, isn't it? Despite everything that the experts said at the time. It is true that the Eurozone has managed to outperform Japan, although I think if you did that on a per capita basis, you will find that actually it didn't. So as far as the bare fact the euro has not brought any benefits. I also want briefly to touch on something of a global nature, which I think hardly gets any airing. I think that the euro has been a disaster for the world economy as well. Now, this chart shows what's happened to the current account surpluses, again, of that range of countries, with a few different ones put in, Switzerland, because it runs a pretty big surplus. The Eurozone, China, Japan, the oil producers, and Switzerland. And the Eurozone is again in blue. What has happened to the picture of current account surpluses over the last several years? Well, what's happened is that the Eurozone has raced up the rankings to be the largest current account surplus zone in the whole world, beyond China, beyond Japan, beyond the oil producers. Why? Well, because essentially the Eurozone has turned the whole zone, has become Germanic as a result of the euro. Massive surpluses. Why does this matter? Because it's sucking demand out of the world economy and it's fueling protectionist urges in a number of countries, not least the United States. Now, at the moment, we hear all the stuff from Trump about China. Look where China is compared to the Eurozone with regard to current account surpluses. The euro, I think, has been a disaster for the world economy. Next slide. Has the euro brought convergence among the countries that belong to it? Well, it depends which variable you look at. This shows inflation. And I think the answer, as far as that's concerned, is yes, it has brought convergence. And indeed, in a number of countries that have otherwise done very badly, including Greece and Italy, as you can see, their inflation rates have converged pretty much on the core. Well, whoopee. As a former British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, once said, there's no inflation in a graveyard. Yeah, inflation's converged. Next chart, please. Sadly, that's not true of unemployment. Now, interestingly, as you can see, not long after the euro was formed, the unemployment rates, I haven't shown all the Eurozone countries because it would be too messy, but I've shown the key ones here, Germany, Italy, Greece, France and Spain. Not long after the euro was formed, there was a dramatic convergence of unemployment rates. The reason, of course, was that there were unsustainable booms unleashed by the euro in the weaker countries, and that brought unemployment rates down to the rates ruling in the core countries. More recently, of course, that's gone the other way, and as we all know, unemployment rates have soared in a number of these countries. More recently come down a bit, but they're still well above unemployment rates in the core. What about the current account position? I gave you the Eurozone as a whole current account position. I think it's worth looking at the position between member countries. There's undoubtedly been a change, as I say, as the euro has forced all the other countries to effectively become Teutonic. The current account balances of individual member countries in 1999, shown there in red, and in 2018 in blue. Greece only barely in deficit this year, probably. Similarly, France. The others moved into surplus. Italy was surplus to begin with, more of a surplus now. Actually, the divergence between the biggest surplus and the biggest deficit, far from converging, is actually increased. What about GDP? What about convergence in GDP performance within the Eurozone between member countries? Well, you must be joking. Now, many of these charts, I'm afraid, I haven't shown Greece for the simple reason that if I did, you wouldn't see anything else. You'd just see Greece off the, you know the story, off the scale, and you wouldn't see any pictures of any meaning. So I'm leaving Greece out. This chart shows, it's on the same basis that I showed my first chart. That's to say GDP in a number of countries within the Eurozone going back to when the euro was formed in 1999. Now, I've put the UK on. Now, I assure you, that's not because I'm under the misapprehension that UK is in the euro, nor because I think that the UK might be about to join the euro, but rather for sake of comparison. It's an interesting picture, and you can see that over this period, the UK economy has tied for first place with Spain. Interesting that. Spain having recovered dramatically well, and GDP having increased since the euro was formed by about 42% in the UK, poor old UK, suffering from all that, having to compare prices with calculators and, you know, coping currency risks and balling. Spain slightly stronger. Then becomes France and Germany, the core countries, the motor, driving ahead to prosperity, 32%. Then Portugal, round about 15%. And there's dear old Italy, 9%. Convergence? You must be joking. And then let's look at consumption on the same basis. And I do that because it tells a very interesting story. Most of the countries have got the same sort of rise in consumption over that period as they have GDP. Look at Italy down the bottom there. Again, it's around about 9%, slightly lower. The really interesting country to look at is Germany, in red. Because Germany's GDP, you heard me say, is up by, I think it's 32%, slightly above 30. Germany's consumption, however, is up by only 20%. Now, that gives you the clue as to one of the things that's profoundly wrong with the euro. Here you've got a country which is used to keeping costs down, which is used to saving a lot, spectacularly good at exporting, not so good at importing, running a very prudent, some people might say, prudent to the point of profligacy, public policy with regard to deficits and surpluses. And the result, of course, is that its consumption has been growing at very slow rates. I'll come back to the implication of that in a moment. Next chart, please. And then we come to unit labour costs. Again, since 1999, same basis, same colours. Germany's the country at the bottom, red. Next to no increase in unit labour costs to begin with. More recently, they've been climbing. But they're still up by hardly anything compared to the weaker countries. The country at the top is Greece. That's improved, as you can see, since the crisis point a few years ago. But Italy is the one I want to draw attention to. Italian unit labour costs up over this period cumulatively by about the same amount as Greece. And the gap between Germany and Italy about as big as it has ever been. What about public sector debt and deficits? Convergence there? Well, not really. I've highlighted Italy here in the separate colours, comparing 2009 and 2017. You can see that for most countries, despite or because of the policies pursued, the ratio of public debt to GDP has actually gone up over this period. Some exceptions. You can see there the Netherlands around about constant, Germany down. More about that in a moment. So here you've had a period where you've had policies of austerity throughout the Eurozone, and actually, for most countries, the debt ratios have gone up. Next chart, please. And to bring home the contrast between Germany and Italy, here I show you the figures for debt ratios. Germany, again, in red. Italy, in yellow. Convergence? You must be joking. And similarly, what about the so-called Target 2 balances? This is guaranteed to send most audiences to sleep. I won't explain all this in detail. I know a lot of you are familiar with it, but suffice it to say, this is essentially about the balance of claims and debts within the Euro system of central banks. And in a properly functioning union, you might expect these things to be pretty much offsetting. Every so often, money has to go out from the Bundesbank in euros to fund the Bank of Italy or whatever, and vice versa, and it all comes out in the wash. But not in this case. Look at what's happened to the balance of claims and liabilities. Actually, Germany now has claims of roughly €1 trillion, and of that, getting on for about 500 billion is represented by liabilities of Italy. Now, I say claims, it all sounds terribly good, doesn't it? But the problem is Germany going to get all this money back in the event of a euro bust-up? Well, you can have that one with me, if you like. I think it would be interesting, shall we say. It would be really, really interesting. And all those people listening in Germany, I'm sure many of them are aware already, but this is a key thing to focus on. What is going to be the position of Germany getting its money back in the event that there's a bust-up? Can we go on 2 slides, please? 2 slides. Yeah. And the consequence of all this, I hope I'm racing through things, but I'm trying to make the point that it seems to me pretty clear that the outlier country in all this is Germany. Along with some of the smaller countries, the Netherlands certainly, and it's arguable, I think, that Finland and Austria could join Germany in some other form of monetary union. But let's concentrate on Germany. The current situation within the Eurozone, and as I argued earlier, within the world, is the direct result of the loss of the Deutschmark. Now, when the politicians of Europe, President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl of Germany, neither of them blessed, I think, with an intimate knowledge of economics, put the euro together, the general idea was that the Deutschmark was some sort of problem. It was the source of German power, supposedly, so the French wanted to get rid of that. Actually, they got this completely wrong. The Deutschmark was the thing that kept everybody else in the game. Because if the Germans carried on being super successful exporting and saving a lot and keeping unit labour costs down, the Deutschmark would go up. And as it went up, or other currencies went down, Italy and the UK and France and everybody else and Spain could remain competitive. And the German surplus would be attenuated. It was still a tendency for the Germans to run a surplus, but it would be constantly cut back by the fact that the Deutschmark would go up. And this had dramatic impacts on the shape of the German economy. Because what did this do? It made sure that German consumers shared in the gains of German productivity and German export success, because the Deutschmark going up clobbered companies, transferred real incomes from companies to consumers, and consumers spent the money. So what do we get now? No Deutschmark. That's why we've got German consumption so weak. So the very thing that people thought was the problem was actually the solution. So, hence, I come to my fundamental point. If what's gone wrong is the loss of the Deutschmark, something is staring us in the face. Bring it back. The country that ought to leave the euro is Germany. Now, this has some key implications because, and some of the legal experts may go into these factors later on, but I think just from a broad brush point of view, the key point is, I'm going to come on to Italy in a moment, it's not easy to break up a currency union. It's certainly not impossible, and we've heard that, we've had experience of it. It's not impossible, but it's not easy. There are certain technical issues which need to be faced. It seems to me self-evident that it's much better for a strong country to face those issues than a weaker country. And in particular, if Germany leaves the euro, leaving the euro as the current currency of the weaker countries, including Italy, at least for a time, then you don't get into all the problems of redenomination, possible default, legal wrangles that you do get into if a weaker currency like Italy leaves the euro with all sorts of contracts denominated in euros. Now, whenever I've suggested this in Germany, and I have on a few occasions in Frankfurt and Berlin, and I've been lucky to escape with my life, in general, this echoes what was heard earlier on, the reaction is, oh, but that would be very bad for Germany. Because, you know, we've done so well out of the euro. I said, have you really done so well? Have you seen your consumption figures? German consumers not done very well. Oh, and by the way, do you think you're going to get back all this money? So this doing very well is Germany selling all these wonderful goods, marvellous cars and, you know, Miele appliances and all the rest of it, sending them over to Italy and Greece and everywhere else. And in return, you're getting pieces of paper. And they're called Target 2 balances. Do you think that's a good exchange? Because I rather suspect they're going to keep the Mercedes and the Miele appliances. Or you can keep the pieces of paper if you like, or in this instance, non-pieces of paper, electronic claims, but not going to be worth anything. And the really ultimate reply to those people, my German friends, who say, wouldn't that be bad for Germany? The really ultimate reply is, and I do say this to them, so what you're telling me is Germany did badly under the Deutschmark, did it? That was bad for Germany? I think not. So it would be far better, it seems to me, if Germany left the euro, but of course it may well not happen. So go back a slide, please. Now, so we think about the weaker countries leaving. When my firm and I did the Wolfson Prize essay in 2012, one of the big issues that lots of people raised, quite rightly, was how a country could leave a monetary union and not have a currency. And it just shows you this, how far and how fast technology moves on. It's 2012. The big issue, it takes about, we did investigations, how long does it take to get a currency printed and minted and all the rest of it? And we went into all the firms that do all this and asked, and the answer was, well, probably 6 months. And if you really pushed it, maybe 3 months. So then you run into a difficult situation. So a country's going to leave the currency union, it's declare a new currency, let's call it the new lira or whatever, or the ducat or something, but it's got to have no notes and coins for 3 months, 6 months. Isn't that going to be an horrific problem? And we went in the essay to various ways round it, and there are ways round it. Now, with methods of payment having proliferated, PayPal, phones, contactless cards, you must be joking. This is a complete non-problem. 2 slides further on, please. 2 slides further on. Yeah. So that payment thing has gone. Now, every so often, people say to me, if the euro breaks up, if a country like Italy leaves the euro, there are going to be problems. There are going to be dislocations. To which I reply, oh, do you think that's a knockdown argument? Do you mean to say you don't think there have been problems because of the euro? You don't think that staying in the euro might bring problems? Of course there are going to be problems, and they're all soluble. The key point is Italy has grown by 9% within the euro, 0.4% per annum, at a time when lots of other countries have grown far faster. The UK having to cope, poor devils, with currency fluctuations, having grown by 42%. Is that not a problem with Italian unemployment? It seems to me having the opportunity to get Italian GDP up and Italian unemployment down is worth quite a few legal and technical complications, quite frankly. Now, what would happen? I don't have time to go into detail. It's quite clear, I think, how this is done, and you've got experts on the panel. It's best to prepare a plan in secret, to implement it quickly, to have a short period of closure of the banks, probably capital controls for a short period of time. It may be necessary for there to be some form of default on government debt. There's going to be that within the Eurozone anyway. You're in cloud cuckoo land if you think Greece is going to honour its debts, and not about Italy, cloud cuckoo land. And there will have to be programmes to support the banks, but it can be done. The key point is, in redenominating the currency, you give countries like Italy the chance to escape from this trap, to devalue their real exchange rate, to boost net exports, and to grow again. Next slide, please. I hope my conclusions are fairly clear. I think the euro was completely misconceived from the start. It was never going to work. It was a political vanity project. It has cost trillions, and it has ruined millions of lives. It's time to call a halt. The country that should leave, the country that's most out of line, is Germany. It's best placed to leave. It can do so. It can bear the costs and difficulties of leaving. If it doesn't happen, then I think weaker countries, and in particular Italy, because although it's weak in relation to these comparisons, it's also strong, and I think it could have a very prosperous future outside the euro, that Italy should face the difficulties and leave. These difficulties, we'll hear about them more in a moment. There are a few technical, financial, economic problems. They're not big, quite frankly. The major difficulties that remain are political and legal. They're also solvable. Just do it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bootle. These were clear words concerning the so-called convergence and clear words concerning the so-called benefits of the monetary union. It was an intellectual pleasure not only for me to listen to your remarks concerning the profits of the Eurozone. Thank you very much for that. That was truly enlightening. Der nächste Redner, meine Damen und Herren.
Our next speaker is Dr. Mojmir Hampel. His perspective is that of a small EU country not within the Eurozone.
You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do not know which one to take. I'll take both. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and many thanks to organizers for a kind invitation to this event. Some of you might ask a question, why are you here, Mr. Hampel? You are a representative of a monetary orthodoxy, of a standard central bank operating in the system of elastic money. Why are you here? And I can tell you that not only I'm a well-known Eurosceptic in the Czech Republic, as some of those living in my country know, I also like challenges. And this, in a sense, is a challenge, because to speak about a potential of Euro breakup right here at this place is, to me, it's similar like to speak about the end of the rule of Vladimir Putin in Kremlin directly. So really, really challenging thing. But I've got a very complicated start, because Roger Bootle has made so many points I wanted to make, especially the key point about strong ones and weak ones and their incentives to potentially to leave, and the key point about the European monetary integration and well-being of the population in the monetary union, that I can summarize it and say thank you very much for your attention. It has already been said. So, but I would not deserve my salary as a central banker and an economist today. So I will try to concentrate on some other points. And I have to say that my big advantage is really that I'm coming from a country which is outside the monetary union. So I might concentrate a bit more on the issue of monetary unions in general, and how we coped with our own autonomous monetary policy as the Czech Republic after the breakup with Slovakia. So I will start with one question. I'm sure that all of you know the name Yanis Varoufakis, and I'm sure that many of you do not share his political ideas. But he once asked a question: is currency union membership like the Eagles Hotel California? So you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, or not? This is his quote. And if you look at the history, and if you do not concentrate on the Eurozone as such, you will see that, to some extent, monetary unions in general, over the course of history, are sometimes quite fragile, unstable, and are not everlasting. This is to some extent the definition of a monetary union, which is not based on a single state, but on a cooperation of individual states. So, in fact, at least 69 countries, I'm counting to 69, or territories have left various currency unions since the end of the Second World War. Almost 70 of them. So you can say almost each and every year after the end of the Second World War, there was at least one country leaving some kind of a monetary union in the world. We do not realize this because we are focusing that much on Europe, on the Eurozone, and what is happening here. And we also tend to forget that we have got more than one monetary union right now in Europe. Don't forget about the monetary union, very well-functioning monetary union between Switzerland and Liechtenstein, for instance. We have got almost monetary unions, but this is a slightly different scheme. Countries using other currencies in Europe than their own, Monaco, Andorra. You have got a case of unilateral acceptance of foreign currency on their territory, like Montenegro. You have got a so-called monetary union between Turkey and northern Cyprus, where the Turkish lira is used as a currency. So, you know, let's not be EMU-centric that much. There are many more examples of monetary unions in the past, and the landscape is much more colorful than it might seem at first sight. Interestingly, and this is the point, and I really want to share it with Roger Bootle, scientific literature seems to be suggesting that it is more likely for big, rich, and more democratic countries to leave monetary unions rather than other types of countries. I have got no generally accepted theory explaining this finding, but this is an empirical finding. And this is the point, just to illustrate what one might also expect in the case of the Eurozone. It has been said, but I would like to stress it once again. I somehow do not believe that the biggest incentives in any kind of monetary arrangement like the Eurozone to leave is on the side of the weaker ones, especially if the weaker ones are also with democratically elected elite. I don't believe that. I think the incentives are always rather on the side of the stronger ones. If you look at the history, at these various kinds of monetary unions, there is one defining feature for almost all of them. In almost all monetary unions, there is at least one monetary hegemon, someone who is hegemonic in it, and others are centered around this hegemon. I think this was the role of Germany, in a sense. Because for me, and this is what I wrote in a paper for the German Economic Review, without Germany, monetary integration in Europe doesn't make that much sense. It is thinkable without any other state in Europe, but it's not thinkable without Germany. So if you haven't got Germany on board, you haven't got any monetary integration in Europe. But it seems to me, and after reading all those nice books, especially by David Marsh, it seems to me that the very idea at the very beginning of the monetary union was to diminish the hegemonic role of Germany, or to get rid of its status, or to free ride on its status. This was the idea of many countries in Europe trying to fix permanently their exchange rate with the then Deutsche Mark. And this creates a lot of instabilities and a lot of fragile moments which then appear each and every moment when there is a crisis and where there is some instability. So this is the idea. If you haven't got a clearly defined hegemon, or you are trying to kill the hegemon, you are going into difficulties, especially in bad times. What is interesting also, and here I'm referring to some papers by my favorite theorist Andy Rawls. What is interesting, the trade as such does not matter that much. There was always these ideas that you need the monetary union to foster foreign trade and increase cross-border trade. The data, the empirical evidence doesn't seem to be suggesting that this is really true. If you look, for instance, at our country, the Czech Republic is one of the most closely connected economically in terms of trade and investment with Germany. We have been experiencing ever-expanding trade and investment links with Germany, despite not sharing the currency with Germany at all. Even more so, we've been experiencing ever-expanding trade, and don't be surprised, not trade deficit, trade surplus with Germany. Ever-increasing trade surplus of my own country with Germany, despite we are not sharing the currency with Germany at all, and we are not thinking about it at the current juncture. So these are like empirical points that one should take into account when discussing all these ideas, like monetary integration. It has already been said by Jiří Payne, which is it's excellent that his name is Payne. You know, I mean, this in English it sounds perfect, but it's perfect for this debate about the euro, the pain for the eurozone. It has been said that one of the countries that has got a let's say long-term experience with actually breaking up the current monetary scheme, the current monetary system, is actually my country, the Czech Republic. There was this example of former Czechoslovakia after the end of the First World War, and then of course a nice example of 1993 when we split the former Czechoslovakia into two independent states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And here comes to your mind the idea of optimum currency area. I believe that you've heard about that. One might argue that you have got an optimum currency area between USA and Canada, almost, and no monetary union. But one would definitely argue that after 70 years of a single state, you would have to have something that resembles an optimum monetary area, optimum monetary zone. Despite that, our monetary union, after the breakup of Czechoslovakia, didn't last longer than 38 days. 38 days. So almost unbelievable how some tensions without this former monetary union were huge, so that the monetary union, even between these two states, became unsustainable after basically one month. So how huge the tensions must be in bigger monetary unions, how much pain, costs, and everything is hidden behind some decisions and some results that we can see. As it has been said, no catastrophe followed. In fact, both former members of the dissolved union have been relative success stories. At least since 2000, and in the context of Central Europe, both of them, I mean the Czech Republic and Slovakia, believe they are actually better off economically and also in terms of bilateral relations than they were prior to the split. So this is just to tell you our story. And it's instructive to focus on the monetary history of these two independent states of Czechs and Slovaks. Slovaks rushed for the euro. Czechs have shown the lowest support for potential euro adoption among all countries that the current Eurobarometer surveys. So even lower than the support for the euro in our country, which is fascinating, is even lower than in Sweden, where they had their own referendum denying actually entering into the EMU. So how these two countries might have different views regarding monetary policy and monetary integration. The Slovak perspective, and there are Slovaks, so they might comment on that as well, but in my understanding, the Slovak perspective was an implicit need to buy some credibility for monetary policy and low inflation via the euro membership, and also some credibility for the central bank from abroad. And also, it was a way how to possibly cement ambitious economic reforms carried out at the beginning of the century. On the other hand, the Czech perspective was always no need to buy the credibility from abroad, because if you are capable of keeping low inflation and monetary stability with your own means, you do not need that much to buy the credibility from abroad. So, and by the way, a political factor like national pride plays to some extent a role, but a minor one, as few observers would consider the Czechs to be more nationalistic than Slovaks, by the way. So here, again, some things that a poor economist cannot easily explain. So let me sum up. Historical data do not seem to be suggesting that there are always prohibitive costs of exiting a currency union. But I'm well aware of the fact that the bigger the monetary union is, the more open capital flows are, the more complicated is the whole process of potential breakup or leaving the currency union, despite the fact that we discussed that in the corridor, despite the fact that we have seen an effective way of imposing capital controls even within the EMU. Even within the EMU, there were capital controls in Cyprus. Almost unbelievable things in terms of theory and practice. So it's not entirely inconceivable But I would not underestimate the potential costs. You are talking about the benefits. Do not underestimate the costs, and do not underestimate the incentives. The incentives on the side of all players. And again, once again, I think the stronger ones have got more incentives. And it seems to me, after going through all this literature, that going back to Varoufakis, the best precaution against the cost of exit seems to me not entering the Hotel California in the first place, which is an advice that I'm always giving to my political guys, the political elite in my country. Of course, the decision is always political, and the idea about joining the Eurozone is a political one. But if you do not want to deal with some kind of painful questions, please, in the first instance, do not enter this zone. And this is the experience of my country, and I hope we will go down this road, and we will prove that. Some sentences of Mr. Varoufakis are completely wrong. Basically, I think the majority of them is completely wrong. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hampel, for your sober words that put things in perspective. What I take from you is that what we are talking about today, the exit from a currency union, is the rule and very usual. Es folgt nun Dr. Malinen aus Finnland von der Universität von Helsinki.
From the University of Helsinki. He has written a paper where he goes into the details of Fix-It, the exit of Finland. And without further ado, Dr. Malinen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the EFD for calling me here. And thank you also, Mr. Bodil and Dr. Hampel, for the rather excellent remarks, which are actually kind of an introduction to what I'm going to say. The one thing that got me thinking, actually, is that Finland, our economy, is strong enough, but still we are suffering. So economically, we would be rather optimal to leave. But the thing here in this paper, and also within our group, the Euro think tank, who has prepared this, is that we don't want to make a statement should we leave or not, but we just want to map out how, if Finland would like to leave, how would it go. So what I'm going to shortly summarize here is a end result of 2 years of rather active research of our group, which consists of economists, former government officials, central bank officials, and financial market experts, and a statistician also. And we heard about a dozen experts from different fields to get this done. And what was kind of striking to me, that only a handful of them wanted that they were tanked. So we acknowledge their help in our intro. That kind of tells you how touchy the issue is. But to begin with, why would Finland leave? I think it's rather clearly. Please change the slide. Yeah. So here. Sorry, there's a few words in Finnish here.
Slide 2. Slide 2,
yeah. No, one, back. No. The slide one before, yes, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, the Dane has always to take care of the Finn.
That's how it goes. We are very good at technical issues, but, presentations.
Scandinavian.
Yeah, that's how it has gone. But anyway, here we present the blue line is the Finnish exports, the volume of exports, and the reddish line is the average volume of exports of Eurozone. And as you can see, since 2008, we have taken a kind of hit. We have seriously lagged about 30 percentage points from the average export growth of the Eurozone. And the thing is that we have been an export-driven country for 200 years, sorry. So even 100 years before our independence, we were highly reliant on exports. And that's now kind of gone. Next slide, please. So back in early 2012, our firm, the GNS Economics, we made a synthetical simulation of how Finnish exports would have developed if we would have had the markka. And we found that in late 2011, or the end of 2011, they would have been some 15 percentage points higher than they actually were. And the question, of course, now is that where would the Finnish exports be if we would have our own currency? So these small things, and this is actually this figure that got me thinking the first time that is there any point of Finland being in the euro? And it kind of gave us the push few years later to take up the task of finding out how an exit would proceed. So, next slide. And this is, some of them are sliced, the slices. So, would you please make it sure that the whole slide is shown? Yeah. No, yeah, that's good. No. So this is an academic habit, you know, you slice the slides and this happens. So anyway, when a country is leaving basically any currency union, there are three questions that determine how manageable it is, the exit, and what will be the cost. So the first one is, can the exiting country guarantee the function of the payment system during the exit, and can it establish a independent central bank? The second one is, what is the possible economic and political retaliation on the part of the remaining monetary union countries? And the third one, probably the most crucial one actually, is can the banks or generally the financial sector, companies and governments remain solvent and liquid during the exit phase? We, or I, for that matter, take no stand on the possible retaliation issue here because it's a political decision mainly. And what is also rather clear is that in the Eurozone, as every single member country has its own central bank, establishing an independent central bank is really easy. So I'm not going to go there either. Okay, next slide. So in Finland's case, two issues rise above others when you consider the cost of an exit. So the first one is that Finland has been among the first countries to fully integrate payment systems to the European ones. And the ability to change or actually create a new payment system, and also the ability to operate under alternative measures while you're building a new payment system is very crucial. And then there's the solvency of Finnish institutions. So just to start with the few legal issues. So and what makes Finland quite interesting case is that we didn't have any referendum and any bigger discussion of joining the euro. Our government at the time assumed that when we have joined the EU, it would, you know, directly lead to the fact that we need to leave the euro. We need to go to the euro too. And this makes, in technical and law terms, the exit of Finland rather easy. We can do it with government proposal given over a weekend. So in technical terms, in law terms, the exit of Finland would be rather easy. And there are a few laws here. Oh, sorry, next slide. The full slide, please. Yeah. And there are the few laws there listed below which should be changed. Okay, but next slide. The full slide, yep. Okay, so, but the question for Finland and basically all of the Eurozone countries is that how you cope with the lack of a domestic payment system when you're leaving the Eurozone. So, in basically any country that leaves has three options. It either needs to operate the existing euro area payment systems and use euros through a mutually agreed exit strategy. The second one is to need to change some other payment system that is in place at the time and also on the other currency. So in Finland's case, it would be probably Sweden or Denmark. And the third option is that establish capital controls, like Mr. Pulu stated, introduce a new national currency, and recreate a new payment system while operating on these temporary and, by necessity, some inefficient temporary measures. It is our take that number three is the one option to go. If you think about the first option, there is really like no one to negotiate with, and there is no as there is no exit clause from the Eurozone, there is no method in place how a country could like move forward with the current system and in a mutually agreed way. The second one would mean that Finland would change to another monetary sovereignty from the ECB under some other central bank, which makes absolutely no sense. So it's the best option to establish a tight capital controls like they had in Cyprus and introduce a new national currency, make all foreign exchanges or transfers at the border, and build a new domestic payment system. And this, I think, would be the best option for Finland and for other countries too. Next slide. Okay, so although Finland now lacks the domestic system for the bank clearing, we have two important advantages. First is that Finland has just few banks, basically three of our major banks take account of 90% of all retail payments, and over 80% of our retail payments are made using either cards or digital payment systems. So issuing capital controls and operating either using the euro system, just making the forex exchange transfer at the border, or then creating a completely new system based on coins and notes and whatever, we could rather easily or with rather little costs leave the euro. And if it would be the case that we would not be able to use any euro area payment system while in the transfer, we could just operate with a very simple bank-run economy, and banks would clear, basically banks would clear at the end of the banking day by transferring checks from one another, like they did in the 1990s, basically. Next slide. Well, in Finland, the solvency questions is rather easy. So most of the loans and deposits in the banks operating in Finland are governed by Finnish law and can therefore be instantly redenominated to the new markka under the lex monetaire, which is the principle of currency or domestic currency or of law of domestic currency in the international law. All of the government debt, which is around 111 billion euros, is under Finnish law and consists of Finnish jurisdiction bonds, which means that they can be also easily transferred into the new currency. But the problem is that around half of these carry the so-called collective action clauses, which means that they probably need to be paid back in the respective currencies. And then the most of the corporate debt, which is around 234 billion, is under Finnish law and thus can be redenominated to a new national currency. But from this, around 58 billion is under foreign, mostly English or Swedish law, which means that there are some risks if there are individual companies who have foreign currency debt and cannot, transfer it to the new markka, and if the markka depreciates, they can sustain heavy losses. But these are rather small risks. Okay, next slide. So to give some numbers here, we analyzed what would be the short-run costs of Finland leaving the euro. And we considered that two questions are important there. First is how big of a share of these debt contracts could be redenominated to the new markka? How large and how long would the possible depreciation of the new marka be? And like I explained on the previous slide, it's likely that at least some of the debt contracts would be redenominated to the new currency of Finland. And because Finland has a positive net foreign payment position, this could bring some considerable benefits for Finland. But the problem is that we don't really know how long would the redenomination take. In worst case, it could take years. And during this period, the new Finnish currency would appreciate, depreciate probably even many times. So we have kind of ruled out all those possible benefits. So the short-run cost of an exit, we define two major groups. First is the net foreign asset position of Finland and the operational costs stemming from the systemic changes one needs to make the payment system operate under a new domestic currency. So, and here are the figures we ended up with. So on the green one there, on the green slide, sorry, yeah, change the slide. There are the operational costs. So first is the 6 billion euros. It's a planning, production, and adapting a distribution channel of a new currency, including the ATMs. Second one is updating the payment system, which basically is just creating a new domestic payment system, clearing system, and establishing a new accounting systems for banks. And we estimate it to cost around 3 billion euros. And then there are some unforeseen costs, which we estimate to be around 2 billion cost. So in total, these operational costs, relating to the fact that you need to change some systems and introduce a new currency, would be, according to our estimate, around 11 billion euros. And then in the blue box, there are the variable costs. And there we have presented two sets of depreciation, either that the Finnish market depreciates 5% or it depreciates 15%. And what is interesting that these total variable costs actually are rather indifferent in a national scale, comparing between the different levels of depreciation. However, there are rather big differences, like example, corporations, banks and financial institutions and government would take a deeper hit, the bigger hit, the deeper the depreciation of the new marka would be. And on the other side, the social security funds would increase. But in total, in the best case scenario, we found that the cost of Finland's exit would be roughly around 10 to 11 billion euros, which is about 4.7% of GDP. And that's not a whole lot. And this is what Mr. Pudlo also stated, that the cost of leaving the euro have most likely been overestimated by a huge margin. So, next slide to conclude. So, from our analysis, there are two things that really stand out when country considers the costs of leaving the euro. First is the payment systems, which have been integrated throughout Europe, and then there's the external financial position of a country. And in our calculations, basically show that these need not to be very large, at least in the case of Finland. However, if there would be legal issues, maybe changes in constitution would be required, larger darker two imbalances, poor external financial positions, and large currency depreciations could create or increase these costs rather heavily. So there are some risks. But the general rule is that if the private and public debt is under national jurisdiction and law, even the high debt levels should be manageable in an euro exit. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Malinen, thank you very much for your thoughtful speech. It seems to me that the obstacles to an exit are all very visible for us. But we know that what problems we will be facing with that. And most important, what I take from your words is that we would very well be able to overcome them. Dear guests, we now will have a short coffee break for about 10 minutes. We have a few refreshments right beside here. Let me please you to be back at your place in 10 minutes because we have a large program today. And we will continue in 10 minutes with 2 further expert speaker presentations, and after that with a discussion panel of experts. Thank you.
This is exactly it. I absolutely agree. I think, like in our case, it's the question of political decision.
Yeah,
it's not about, you know, making all these estimates. It's just a political decision. It's absolutely fundamental.
If we decide it,
if you've got this, you've got everything.
Yeah, it will work.
And without it, you've got nothing.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely.
After a few months, nobody will talk about it anymore.
Absolutely.
Freut mich sehr. Da haben Sie einen extra.
Excuse me, do you have a boarding pass?
Yes, but I need to use it going back.
Take a picture of it? Yeah, easily. But
May we have your attention, please? We would like to begin with the second half of the conference in a few minutes' time. Thank you.
gut. Ja, das haben die schon so mitgekriegt. Guck mal hier. Hier geht autoritär zu.
Sozusagen, wenn jetzt 40 weiter ist, immer 10 Minuten hinten dran, das geht halt von der Podiumsdiskussion weg, aber ich finde es.
Wenn Sie langsam wieder auf die Plätze gehen.
If everyone could just come back into the room and take their seats, we'll get the show back on the road.
Okay.
This is mine.
So, wir fahren fort.
On we go. I'm sure people will resume their places in due course. Anyway, I'm glad that everyone's back and firing on all cylinders. We are going to be looking at the Lars Christensen, former banker. He's working with the Adam Smith Institute in London.
Interested in what you have to say about the peg of the Danish krone to the euro. I always like to think of this as a kind of euro light. What are the problems there? Please, you have the floor.
Danke sehr, Professor Meuthen, and that's all the German you will get. I am not drunk enough to be fluent in German. Yes, to give you a personal perspective on monetary policy failure or the failure of monetary union, the reason I speak with a heavy Danish accent rather than with a heavy Swedish accent is that in 1880, my great-great-grandfather immigrated from southern Sweden to Denmark. That's how I became Dane and not Swede. Why did my great-great-granddad leave Sweden to come to wonderful Denmark? Well, monetary union. In 1873/75, the Scandinavian countries formed a monetary union. Not in the sense of what we know monetary union of today. It was really just a strict peg. But what happened was that Sweden joined that currency union with a significantly overvalued krona. Denmark joined the currency union with a significantly undervalued krone. Yeah, it's hard to understand the differences between those two words. Consequently, Denmark went through an economic boom in the late 1870s and early 1880s, while Sweden went into an economic slump that lasted for 15 to 20 years. Despite of that, the Scandinavian monetary union lasted until the First World War, when that effectively, not officially, but effectively ended that monetary union. And why do I start there? Well, I've been asked to talk about the Danish experience with monetary policy, and I think that the experience of Denmark historically tells you something about what we should be looking for in terms of currency union going forward. and the attraction to pegged exchange rates. And now I have a Finn on the one hand and a Dutch on the other hand. I might as well have talked about Finnish or Dutch monetary history, because those two countries, particularly the Dutch, have had a parallel story of monetary history since then. The Netherlands, of course, did not participate in the Scandinavian currency union, but rather in the Latin currency union, but it was the same thing, essentially. What we notice is that small European countries seem to have an attraction to pegged exchange rate, to throwing away the possibility of having an independent monetary policy. And therefore, it is natural from a historical perspective that any smaller European nation would join the monetary union or the monetary regime of the day. So let me go back and tell you how that has developed in Denmark and why we are in this odd situation of actually being the only country in the EU, when the Brits have left, that had an opt-out from the euro. Everybody else has obligation to join the euro. In Denmark, we do not have that obligation, luckily. We have had 2 referendums on this in Denmark, and we voted no twice on that. I personally is a strong believer in the EU has some value. I am very unhappy to see the Brits leave. If there's any French in the room, I'm sorry to say this, but the Brits are leaving us with the French. Or we are losing the Anglo-Saxon leg, where Denmark, Sweden, Finland to some extent, the Netherlands, and some of the Central Eastern European countries also are. So the Anglo-Saxon free market perspective is losing a lot of weight within the EU as a consequence of the Brits leaving, and therefore I'm certainly very unhappy about it. But what it is in terms of this is that we have had a currency union that has created the divisions that have led to this. We will see, if we look at monetary history of Denmark, that there are always tensions in any monetary regime. We can all think about what is the optimal monetary regime for a country. I have written a lot on that. I have some ideas about what ought to be the right monetary regime, what kind of target should central banks have, and so forth. But if we study monetary history, we will see that there are always trade-offs, that we cannot just choose the optimal because the optimal is not around. If you're Italian, you are quote-unquote blessed with Italian politicians. So that will put significant strains on your monetary regime no matter what. You know, Italy will not stop being Argentina-like just because it's in a monetary union with Germany. So that straitjacket will not change countries, and I think that's important, and that's a failure of the euro, is that we thought that if we imposed a German straitjacket, everybody would become German. Thank God that didn't happen. That was a friendly neighbor saying that. We in Denmark pegged to gold within the Scandinavian currency union until the First World War. After the First World War, we essentially re-established our peg. Denmark very much followed the lead of Britain, had revaluations trying to return to pre-World War I parity levels on gold, failed in the same way as Britain did. Britain then famously in 1931 gave up the gold standard, the best economic policy decision Britain made before the Second World War. And of course, Denmark immediately gave up our peg to gold and floated the Danish kroner for 2 years. Since 1873, the Danish kroner has floated only 2 years, 1931, 1932. But we are humble people that don't feel that we can stand on our own. We need to have somebody to peg to. And since the only thing we were doing in the 1930s was exporting bacon, we thought we will peg, not as I had suggested, to the price of bacon, but to the sterling. And we did that in 31 and continued to do that until after the Second World War, which we then joined Bretton Woods as everybody else, and essentially had a dollar peg. And that lasted till the end of until the Bretton Woods broke down. And in the 70s, we did as every other European country, we were scrambling to find some kind of monetary regime that worked. And there was a number of shocks in the 1970s, supply-side shocks, oil price hikes, that makes it impossible to have pegged exchange rates. We had disastrous economic policies in the 70s as everybody else. And therefore, in 1982, Danish politicians decided now it was end of the pegs and we would peg to the German mark. The Germans know how to do things. So we pegged to the German mark. We did that at a very good time. Everybody thinks that the peg in itself was the story. But essentially, if you ask Danish policymakers about the Danish peg, they will tell you it has been in place since 1982. It is, of course, not correct, but mentally, that's the point. And I think that when we talk about monetary experiences, we should see it in terms of exactly that. That different countries have very different experiences of pegs and floating exchange rates and other regimes, because as Milton Friedman said, my great hero, never underestimate the importance of luck of nations. It makes one hell of a difference whether you join the Scandinavian currency union with an undervalued currency as Sweden did, with my great-granddad was a teenager, or you join with a significantly undervalued currency. And therefore, we will have these different experiences. So if you'd ask Danish policymakers, they have the experience of joining or pegging to the German mark in 1982, and that was the start of a successful economic stabilization that essentially has lasted to this day. However, you will see in my bio that in the mid-90s, basically as my first job as of being after becoming an economist, worked as a policy advisor in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. I became speechwriter for Marianne Jelved, who was in the 1990s Danish Minister of Economics. Mrs. Jelved is a strong proponent of Danish Euro membership. When we voted on the euro in 2000 in Denmark, I took a day off the next day to take care of my partying headache. The minister also had an headache. We didn't talk to each other for a few days. We didn't have the same perspective of what happened. Interestingly enough about Marianne Jelved, who I hold in quite high esteem, is that she, if you would ask her to tell the story about the Danish peg and the euro, she would say, we tried to get in twice, we failed, and we are worse off because of that. The first policy decision Marianne Jelved made as Minister of Economics in the late summer of 1993, during the ERM crisis, was to devalue the Danish kroner. We remained pegged, but the fluctuation band against the D-mark at that time was widened to plus minus 15%. Denmark at that time had been in economic crisis from 1987 to 1993. Unemployment at that time was at 13%. The impact of that devaluation was exactly the same as it was in the UK in the same year, a swift economic recovery, going from a contraction in the money supply to expansion on the money supply, and in the mid-90s, Denmark saw swift recovery. If you talk to Danish policymakers, Danish economists, Danish journalists about this period, they will say, oh, we had fiscal expansion. No, we had monetary easing that has disappeared from our collective memory. The fact is that Denmark has many times, despite of having a pegged exchange rate, since 1873, devalued, revalued, moved to parity when something else have happened. We have a strong history of having flexible flexible labor markets, open economy, and therefore we can manage significant supply shocks without exchange rate adjustments. But before I end, will tell a story about something that hasn't been successful, and that has been monetary policy in Denmark since 2008. And I'll give you an example of the Scandinavian countries. Because in the Scandinavian countries, we're all very similar, or so, mostly, or in the Nordic countries, I should say. But we have different monetary regimes. The Swedes and the Norwegians and the Icelanders have floating exchange rates and inflation targeting. In Denmark, we have a pegged exchange rate to the euro, and the Finns, poor people, have joined the euro. They're the most suicidal. If you look at the economic performance of those 5 countries since 2008, you would see Denmark and Finland had significantly underperformed the 3 others. I particularly find the example of Iceland interesting. Iceland, of course, had massive banking crisis in 2008. The entire banking sector collapsed, or the international part of the banking sector. Public debt skyrocketed. As a consequence, Iceland implemented very, very serious fiscal austerity measures. We didn't go through that in Denmark. We didn't have to go through the same kind of fiscal austerity measures. But if you look at GDP per capita in Denmark today and compare that with Iceland, you would see that Iceland have had higher economic growth since 2007 than Denmark had had. Iceland's financial system collapsed, and despite of that, Iceland had done economically better, in terms of growth at least, than Denmark. And what's the difference? A floating exchange rate. If you ask any Danish economist to retell the story of 2008, they will tell you a story about a housing boom, fault of the banks prior to the crisis. I'm not an Austrian economist, I'm a monetarist. There was no housing boom. There was no bubble in Europe. There was only a burst. And there was a monetary contraction. That monetary contraction Denmark imported from the EU, from the euro. The Danish krona came under pressure in 2008. As a result, the Danish central bank took out significant amounts of liquidity from the economy and hiked interest rates. Consequently, of course, the property market collapsed. What I'm arguing here is, even if you are one of the most flexible economies in Europe, if you have a strong commitment to prudent fiscal policies, if you're strong pro-European, if you don't like protectionism, even under that scenario, will be hard hit when you are in a currency union. Our friends in Sweden and Norway and Iceland eventually did much better. And therefore, I also hope that we eventually in Denmark will float the krona. I don't have high hopes for that. I should say that every time we change our currency regime in Denmark, we do it because what we peg to blows up. So it might get sooner rather than later. But That will be my finishing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your clear words and thinking. After your speech, I think everybody should be able to see that the Eurozone's problems are not internal problems, but are affecting other countries as well. Thank you again. Unser letzter Experte.
And our next expert before the discussion is Gunnar Beck from London. He is a lawyer and an expert in a reader in EU law, University of London, barrister in EU law at Essex Court, looking at the history of currencies, how they interact, and we are now going to look at the legal situation post-exit. What exactly do the European treaties say? Dr. Gunnar Beck, you have the floor.
Vielen Dank, Herr Meuthen. I'll deliver my speech in German, but just before perhaps 2 sentences or so in English. It's a disclaimer, really, because Jörg Meuthen has issued a promissory note right at the start, and he's raised expectations. Now, I'm not sure I'll be able to meet those entirely, but rest assured, in the final analysis, there'll be more assets than liabilities in what I've got to say from our point of view, and that's a hell of a lot more than the ECB will be able to offer in the end. Right? Und nun zum eigentlichen Vortrag.
Very good, and I'm going to start on my speech. As you've heard, unlike Brexit, under the EU treaties, there is no euro exit, and because of that, Germany, any other country, none of them are able to leave the euro without simultaneously exiting the European Union itself. Now this is dubious, because actually under the treaties there's no clear, unreserved right to exiting the Eurozone. Article 50 of the EU treaty, which the Brits are now very familiar with, and Article 62 on the Viennese Treaty on Treaty Law, do make provision for the possibility of exiting the euro. They do offer a possibility of exiting the euro, but always at the same time entailing leaving the union. And it's the entire treaty body which is then at an end. Now, leaving the currency without leaving the EU appears to be sanctioned under Article 60 of the Viennese Convention. If we could now have slide 2. Under, there it is. Article 60, subsection 2, the rights of the other contractual parties in the event of infringement of a multilateral treaty by a party to the treaty. C, it says, any contracting partner, apart from the infringing state, can take this infringement as a reason as for the complete or partial suspension of the treaty if substantial infringement by one party, this changes the ability of the other contracting parties to materially live up to the treaty. And then it says under subsection B, is there as well. There are jurists who say that the Viennese agreement on treaty law I'll just call it the Vienna Convention from now on. It's on treaty law. Does it apply to the EU treaty? Well, under Article 5 of the Vienna Convention, it applies to all treaties which are the founding document of an international international organization, quite apart from the actual house rules of said organization. Therefore, whatever the EU treaty says, the Vienna Convention on treaty law is also binding on the EU, or to be more precise, it binds the member states of the EU who have signed up to the treaty and are therefore bound to it. Now, with regard to the Eurozone, the right to partial or complete suspension of a treaty means that Germany is a member of the Eurozone and it could suspend its membership of the Union until such time as the other contracting parties resume their compliance with the Union. And that could be the case if the ECB, that could be the case, and Germany could invoke that option were the ECB to resume its bond purchases, even if the inflation rate does not go down substantially, or reinvests the proceeds from the bonds without the existence of a real deflationary danger. And this would also be the case. Germany would have this option if the other contracting parties sin against the solid state financing, which is enshrined in the sound finances, enshrined in the EU treaties. Am I either going too slowly, or I think things have settled down? Thank you very much. So they absolve the contracting parties in the event of infringement. There is the possibility of suspension of the obligation to respect. Now, that's Article 72 of the Vienna Convention only has to do with the suspending of the entire treaty, but there is also provision for partial suspension. Under those circumstances, reintroduction of a transitional, a temporary, de jure, de facto, limited national parallel currency in Germany. There is nothing stopping the German central bank from exiting the ECB context under those circumstances. Now, target 2 balances, which we have heard about several times this afternoon. The major problem with regard to leaving the euro is the threatening major deficit in the Bundesbank's accounts, given the target 2 claims to the central bank. With the target demands from the Bundesbank, this is basically an overdraft which the Bundesbank gives to other central banks in the Eurosystem if companies and households in those countries have assets in Germany or have purchased German goods whose value exceeds the capital flows from Germany to those countries. The amount of this overdraft, a kind of a gold credit card in the Eurosystem, amounts to 1 trillion euros, trending upwards. Next slide, please, which is number 4. Under Article 35, subsection 2 of the ECB statute, subject to the competences which the Court of Justice enjoys in the event of legal disputes between the European Central Bank on the one hand and its creditors, lenders and third parties, the relevant courts of the individual member states shall apply. And the next slide, please, which is slide 5. Article 12, subsection 3 of the guidelines from the European Central Bank to the Target 2 system states that in the event of disagreements concerning payments between Target 2 component systems, the rights of member states, which is the recipient of a payment from the Central Bank, depending on the headquarters, is compatible with these rules and these guidelines. The ECB guidelines do not state anything else, and this would then mean that German law would apply. The Bundesbank and the German state would then be the creditor to the ECB. Basically, the legal situation for disputes regarding EU treaties should come under the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. Article 35, subsection 5 states that the Luxembourg Court has jurisdiction in the event of disputes involving the treaties and the statutes of a national central bank. As you can see here, this is the actual rules applying to the Target 2 system. And in Article 35, subsection 2, resolution, settlement of disputes, national courts under a principle of a lex specialis. A German court would simply apply German law. Any future German government wishing to exit could, probably, claim the Target 2 claims of the Bundesbank. It could call them in after suspension of German membership in the Euro and the Target 2 system. The question then would arise how the ECB or the Euro system, the system of central banks, would pay the claims. There is a balance sheet in the Target 2 claims. Would the ECB simply pay that out, whether in currency reserves or gold, which they do not have in sufficient quantities? And this is as far as my own vision as a jurist and a politician gets. It's very difficult to see what exactly would happen with claims under Target 2. And this is something where I have to bow to the superior wisdom of the economists. But 3 comments. Even with regard to Target 2 claims, even if there were doubts surrounding that, suspension of Euro membership by the German state would be advisable as early as possible. As long as Germany remains in the Euro system, it would not be possible to remove the gold credit card from the other Euro central banks. And this means the Target 2 balances would continue to accrue, would continue to grow, as long as there was not an attractiveness for international investors. This does not just apply to Germany, but also to Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Finland. Secondly, one option for the Bundesbank would be to reduce its target balances by means of looking at the assets in the target creditor countries by bringing in German or international investors. This could be incentivized without any major financial or bankruptcy risks. But again, this is something economists would need to advise on. With the QE, quantitative easing program, it does suggest that there is a margin there. Thirdly, the Target 2 system does not just function as a gold credit card for the capital losing countries, but also as an export subsidy for the German export industry. German exports or capital flows to Germany would then be possible, which the Euro crisis countries or the Target 2 system could not provide. Under the WHO rules, this would then no doubt be deemed to be an illegal export encouragement by the European Central Bank. But I'm sure that the US presidents may have things to say on that. Would that be illegal under the WHO as an illegal export subsidy? Under the ECB capital key, Germany is a co-holder of the European Central Bank reserves, and would need to and is entitled to a repayment of its gold and foreign currency deposits. There is an economic risk because if the ECB could sell the reserves in the interim, this is unlikely since the other Euro states would have an interest in getting their gold back and their other shares paid in capital to the European Central Bank. And it would need to be agreed that the ECB would need to be deemed or declared a gigantic bad bank, which of course, thanks to Mario Draghi, it already is. And then the reserves would need to be reimbursed paid back to the member states. Now the ESM, here when it comes to profiting loss, this is not advantageous to Germany. Under Article 22 of the ESM Treaty, the ESM leadership has to have a careful investment policy to ensure it has a high credit rating, as high a credit rating as possible. In the event of losses, Germany could challenge the ESM portfolio policy. Germany, of course, is represented in the ESM board and is at the table for the investment portfolio decisions. And if an ESM member challenges the ESM itself, then under Article 37 of the ESM Treaty, the decision is taken by the ESM Board of Governors and at the end of the day by the Court of Justice. And the decision by the Court of Justice would then apply mandatorily on all the members. It's to be expected that the German share of the ESM capital key would be 25% and would be able to avoid the losses prior to the suspension of the treaties. The board's extension of the ESM lending and guarantee volume could avoid this being to the detriment of German taxpayers, reintroducing a national currency. We're talking here about the low double-digit billion area, and that's infinitesimally small compared to the overall target 2 balances of Germany. And with low interest rates, already we're seeing larger amounts leaving from German coffers than the overall losses which Germany would be likely to incur because of the ESM. Now, advantages from Euro exit for Germany. Germany is believed to be the big winner from the Euro, but this is a fiction. It's correct that exports and the balance of trade has substantially improved, has increased since 2002. And we're talking between 1880 and 1914, and then from the start of the 50s until the early 70s, wages in Germany have not increased since the year 2000. Economic growth in Germany is certainly increased in comparison to the Eurozone average. In 1992, the year after the agreements on the Maastricht Treaty, and then reunification under Maastricht in the EU at large and EFTA, according to the World Bank, only Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland and Denmark had a higher GDP per capita than Germany. Can we just move on? Sorry, everyone. So these are the figures for 1992 on this slide. And on the right, you can perhaps see a selection of the countries. Germany is almost at the top, and then the poorer ones are not there, nor the Eastern Europeans for that matter. 2017, these countries were ahead of Germany, but also Ireland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, and Austria as well. So over that period, which I think is the message from Mr. Buttel's slides this afternoon as well. Germany is growing slower than almost all of the non-Euro EU states, and indeed slower than almost all countries worldwide. The Eurozone itself, as well as Japan, has the lowest growth rate of any major global economy. According to Eurostat figures, the median income, the purchasing power parity of German households for 2016 stood at 21,000 euros, compared with 22,293 euros for Belgium, almost 29,000 euros for Denmark, 22,000 plus for Ireland, almost 22,000 euros for France. So this is France in 2016. Despite the description of the Euro crisis, it still had a higher GDP income per capita than Germany, and then 22,500 for the Netherlands, almost 24,000 for Austria, and almost 26,000 for Sweden. So, and that they're all above Germany in terms of median income. And according to an ECB study of 2013, this is slide 6, Germans had the smallest private holdings across the Eurozone, less than Greece, than Greeks, Spaniards, Cypriots, and far lower than the Italians and the Irish. According to a study by the DZ Bank, the zero interest rate policy of the ECB between 2010 and 2016 cost German savers 436 billion euros in lost interest rate earnings. In the meantime, that figure has gone up to 600 billion euros since 2010, which is a major transfer of assets from Germany to the south of Europe, to broken banks, and to the German tax man. This is a huge, which is on a par with the target 2 balance losses of Germany as well. So basically, Germany has record export flows, but apart from the upper echelons of German major companies, ordinary people have lost out, and German exit from Euro would increase the standard of living and the purchasing power parities because of cheaper imports, and the saving interest rates would not be artificially stifled. The competitive advantage would be compensated for. With the dollar standing at 140, German export industry would be earning record amounts. Like, for example, way back in the 1950s. If it left, there would not be the transfer payments to the failing Euro states and Euro system banks. And the extension of the Eurozone, according to the Macron model, clearly spells a further worsening of the target 2 balances. So leaving the euro is not just a possibility, it's only common sense. Thank you.
Na, Herr Dr. Beck, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beck. Now, some people say that lawyers cannot give economic presentations, but I think you've proved the contrary is true. You have presented a very interesting both legal and economic expertise. And I do think you've shown us a way that we could use legal channels to exit the euro. Now, certainly that has met with our expectations. Thank you very much. This is new territory for us. Now you can see there's a bit of commotion up here, but so Yasmina is going to take over the chairing of our discussion, and there'll be some more experts coming up to join us. This is going to go quite quickly. Please, I advise you to stay because there's going to be very interesting Q&A, and of course you'll have an opportunity to put questions. But I would like to thank all our speakers. You'll have an opportunity for questions, and it will be possible to ask questions regarding some of the presentations we've already heard. I'll now hand over.
Hat immer Platz, übergebe ich das Wort an.
I'll hand over the chair now.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morton.
Jelte Wiersma, I'm the European Affairs correspondent since 4 years for Elsevier. It's the leading Dutch weekly on politics, economic affairs, and so on in Holland. I never saw so many professors and doctors and other titles switch sides so quickly. It was very impressive. Thank you for that. We have a panel discussion, and you all here in the audience are invited to ask questions at some point, and so please stay and don't hesitate to join. Your question can, of course, include an opinion, but don't stress it too much, since at some point we all want to go for dinner, I presume. First of all, I would like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves to all of you. First, I would like to a very brief introduction, please, from Mr. Starbati to begin with, Professor Starbati.
Ja, ich bin seit 2000.
I've been a member of the European Parliament since 2014, and previously I was professor at the University of Tübingen and Bochum for 15 years, and I've always been studying and dealing with currency policy. Now, maybe I could make a bit of a cutting remark. Obviously, we all know we're dealing with tectonic shifts. We can't necessarily feel them yet, but they're certainly on their way. However, when I look at the public here in the room, I'm wondering how many members are present. It's actually surprisingly few. In other words, it shows that the interest that we've aroused isn't very big. So I've actually very rarely heard a panel being able to present the situation in such a sharp, incisive manner. Now, we've heard from the speakers that clearly, if you're going to adopt the euro, there's going to be a political union. No, that's not the case. The French, for example, do not have an interest to give up their sovereignty. They're always doing the same kind of politics. They build new body after new body, but they don't want to give up their sovereignty. As we heard from Mr. Brutal, with the euro, it's just about trying to keep a balance of power. And we understand it in the world. Everyone talks about keeping inflation down. That's seen as a virtue, trying to do as well as the others. But actually, the French just want to even out the rankings of the virtuous. That was what the currency union was about. So it's about trying to take power away from the Bundesbank. Now, the idea of being competitive, it's about interest, wages, and exchange rates. These have been communitarized, interests and exchange rates. Now, if the developments, however, vary, previously a country could use exchange rates, but you can't do that anymore. Or they could play with interest rates. We can't do that anymore. The only possibility for adjustments is through the labour market. And there's no tougher adjustments than those that go through the labour market, bring down wages, creating unemployment. That is the toughest form of adjustment. And clearly, in the long run, that cannot maintain.
It's maybe a bit different in Holland than in Germany, I'm not sure. But I very much appreciate your passionate contribution already, because I can see it's an emotional affair. You will have your moment again. I first want to move on to Mr. Radzin. Just please briefly introduce you, and not in a German way, but in a Dutch way.
I'm from Estonia, and I'm from Estonia, from a very small country who traditionally want to be in all kinds of monetary unions. I am here for the second month, and I'm not related to financial things almost at all. I am a lawyer. I'm so far from the financial things that it is perhaps the first time in my life when I earn more or less a decent salary.
Congratulations to you. I'm very happy to hear that. And Mr. Wilk, can you please introduce yourself too?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big honor for me to be here. I'm a member of the Parliament of the Republic of Poland. I'm an economist and lawyer, and this topic is in my very big interest because Poland is now under bigger and bigger pressure to introduce euro. So we need a real, very good discussion about this topic. So this conference is of very big value for me because I'm trying to start real discussion in Poland about the introduction of euro. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. What a big question for me is, since my Italian fiancé and me are looking for real estate to buy in Italy. Does it not work? My Italian fiancé and I are looking for buying some real estate in Italy. We already have a farm in Holland, a flat in Brussels, so now we need to balance and go for Italy too. How fast will everything move if Italy or Germany will leave the Eurozone, and what do you recommend me to do? Should I wait to buy something or not? So to make it simple, for ordinary people like me, what is a wise investment to make from everything we heard? I would first ask if Mr. Moiten is interested to comment on this a little bit. I won't make it easy for you.
Das ist in der Tat nicht ein.
Well, it's not straightforward. I'm an economist, and economists are very bad investment consultants. Now, if I myself had done everything right, then maybe I'd be wealthier than I am today. Well, joking aside, I can't tell you, because we just don't know what could be triggered by currency change. But what I would advise you is make sure, if you're going to do it, don't make it dependent on the currency.
Die Währung abhängig zu machen.
So you're saying I shouldn't make it depend on the currency?
Mache das.
Okay, I'll do that then.
Quite simple, just do it. It doesn't depend on the currency, and we will not know what kind of changes we will have after exiting, if possible, in the next years.
Honestly, the fact that Estonia joined the euro was not a very smart move. It was not the most stupid things we've done during 800 years of our history, but it was among one of the stupid things, but definitely not outrageously stupid. So my proposal would be to all my colleagues here and those who are present to ask a different question. What sense will it make to give euro up once it is there? For Estonia, it was stupid to take euro. I'm afraid that it would be the second stupid to give it up. And simply we have to ask the real functions what we have for these type of currency. My teacher and the book which I read and I faithfully studied and passed even 7 exams, etc., was Karl Marx, particularly second volume, when he really said what are the functions of currency. Among them is capital, reserve, turnover, and the world money. All these functions are performed in many countries by euro, so why not? Although, yes, ideologically, boy, I don't like this money. In old monies, there were nice pictures, wild geese and chess player, and in Lithuanian money there was a pilot, and they were beautiful things. And I have nostalgia, but let us try to answer the question, to leave euro, why? I'm ready to leave, but I want to know why.
Thank you very much. Mr. Starbati, I want to ask you a question, but also the panelists we had before are very welcome to join the discussion at one point. What are we looking at? If we look forward, if we look to the future, what are we looking at when it comes to unraveling the Eurozone? How would that scenario unfold? Can you make any educated guesses about this?
Yeah,
in a currency union with unequal members, there are 3 possibilities. Either a change in the exchange rate or internal adjustments, upwards or downwards. Germany has always internally adjusted downwards, others upwards. Now we have to internally amend downwards, amend the labour market, or give up the current common currency. Now, we know that this currency has not brought Europe together, but it's actually split it. It's damaged Europe. That's a fact. We've heard about the Swedish and Danish kroner, not the Deutschmark that's undervalued. Actually, what we're doing is what Keynes said was beggar my neighbour policy via the exchange rate, increasing your own unemployment rate, and bringing down the neighbours. And the interesting thing is that everyone wants to have it. That's what's so unbelievable. I always ask in the Parliament, when people talk about youth unemployment and get all excited about it, they don't want to sacrifice their people. But I'd say to them, look at the figures. Why has Germany got surplus? Why are taxes coming in? And that's because we've got an exchange rate that's subsidised, and the others have got an exchange rate that's a burden. It's as simple as that. But are we going to be able to learn from history? Well, there are 2 possibilities, the strong one or the weak one. But the view has been put forward that the strong one should leave because it would be more expensive for the weaker to then make the adjustments if they left the euro. But I'm not sure. If I look at the exchange rate, the weaker countries would have to devalue more strongly. That's the consequence. We know with the Bretton Woods Treaty that major disparities cannot be flattened out apart from devaluations. If you just give me a few more seconds, please. I want to finish my point. If we look at all the success stories today, whether it's Hungary, Czech Republic, Ukraine, or whatever, that always started with devaluations. So we've got to look at what's the advantage then? How can these countries become competitive again? The only problem then is that the debt would increase in the new currency. But these debts are not national debts. They're the debts from the nation to the banks. It's the banks who've made a lot of money from financing Greece. And so the banks would be damaged if there were to be change of currency. So maybe there has to just be a haircut. as well as adjustments. That's what would help these countries. Can I just finish, please? If Germany were to leave the euro, and we Germans have a history, First World War, Second World War, National Socialist dictatorship, and then they'd be destroying Europe once again. That's what we would hear from the general public. We've got to be aware then of the political consequences if we decide to leave the euro.
Dank, Professor. De heer Grazien is the...
Just to clarify, strong and weak nations, strong and weak budgets, etc., etc. The problem actually is, coming back to Estonia, that we are very small, but we are awfully strong because we are one of the three countries who follow the Maastricht rules. 60% of the budget deficit, 1.5% above the medium inflation rate, and 3% of the governmental debt. In other words, we are among these 3 or 4 stupid countries in Europe who play by the rules. Neither France, nor Germany, nor any of all these quote-unquote wealthy countries follow the rules that are imposed upon us. So this might be the motive. To get rid of euro means that we can get as relaxed and soft economy as Germany or France. Why not?
Okay, thank you very much. I very much want to push anybody here in the room to make predictions, because of course looking back and telling what happened, as a journalist, I'm very good at that, so I know that drill. But looking forward, how would the Eurozone unravel? Who has the character, who has the guts to come up with a scenario here? Mr. Christensen.
Well, it's kind of what I do for a living, making predictions. I strongly believe that economists are unable to predict anything. But we know about gravity. And I think when I look at the euro area, the problem is here, and I think we're seeing it very clearly. Everybody in the euro area seem to think that they're being cheated. The Germans they whine all the time. We're paying for everything. We're paying for everything. Nobody works as hard as us. Well, Germans work less than Greeks. They have a horrible banking system. Nobody dares telling the Germans that because they're sending all the checks. And the Greeks say, oh, the Germans are telling us everything, and they're whining and whining, and the Italians are whining and whining. Everybody hates each other because of this goddamn euro. But who will leave? And I think the important thing is who is really committed to following the rules. It was interesting to say that the Estonians have followed the rules. Who followed the rules other than that? 2 other countries, you said. Who's that? Denmark and Sweden. Are they in the euro? No. Germany never followed the rules. They just tell everybody else to follow the rules.
Okay, and now the prediction.
What is the prediction then? That somebody who is told to follow the rules will say, to hell with you. And that's the Italians. And why would the Italians do that? I'll give you an example. Italy and Greece are both around 200 years old as modern republics. Half of that time, Greece have essentially been in default. So you can say about the Greek politicians that they cheat international creditors. I was about to use a worse word than that. Italian politicians, who do they cheat? Italians. They get rid of their debt through inflation. Greeks default, Italians inflate. The only way to inflate is to leave the euro. Italy constitutionally is an inflationist country. And therefore, Italy will be the first country to leave. I think it's too bad, but they will be. And that, I don't know whether there will be the unraveling, but that, to me, has all along been the greatest risk, danger. And what I also find interesting in terms of the Italian case is that the Italian opposition to the EU and opposition to the euro is not a populist movement. It might be that the parties in power now are populist, and in my view, some of their views are insane. But we hear the opposition to the euro from what the Germans would call the Mittelstand. The regular center-right voters in Italy had had enough. In Greece, it's Syriza and the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing. But in Italy, it's a centrist position to be skeptical about the euro. And that's why it's much more likely that the Italians will leave before anybody else. But I, by the way, agree with Roger that Germany should leave.
I'm very grateful with your contribution. Your, I wouldn't say fellow countryman, but your favorite neighbor almost from Finland wants to make a contribution on this one. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I'm also in the business of prediction. I would like to make a question, people here. How many of you would be willing to lend to Italy for 10 years for an interest of 3.5%? No one. Yeah, but the thing is, as it happens, as you asked for the prediction of the euro breakup, we actually just published, our firm just published a report 3 weeks ago where we went through this scenario. So it goes like this. First, the ECB tapers, then some economic political shocks hits the, vulnerable countries. Interest rates shoot up. There's a budgetary crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis, and then they cry the ECB and the European Union for help. But there is no mechanism to help. ECB cannot start funding individual countries. EU Commission cannot do that. There's just the ESM, and in Italy and many of the former crisis countries, there's absolutely no political support for starting another austerity program. Alas, they don't have no other option to leave, and then the euro breaks up.
Or there's an alternative. My fiancé always complains that when Italy joined the euro, assets of private citizens and companies were actually frozen and transferred temporarily to make sure the Italian state met the standards. And they at one point got the money back in euros, but it was considerably less than they ever did it in lira. So would that be a scenario that can be repeated, or?
You might want to try that. I'm not betting it's going to go through. With the Italians, very well. Yeah. Thank you.
Sir, you want to make a contribution?
Yeah, I'm also in the prediction business, and I'll make one. Before I do that, though, I want to make a quick comment. Someone or other said everyone's complaining about the euro and that they're losing out from it. You know, the Italians are losing out, the Germans are losing out, the implication being they can't all be right. I think this is wrong. They can all be right. That's to say, they can all be losing out from the euro, and indeed, I think they are, because the weaker countries are losing out from having too strong a real exchange rate. And the stronger countries, aka mainly Germany, are losing out, first of all, because they're lending to these weaker countries and they won't get their money back. And secondly, because the internal structure of demand is completely distorted, so that consumers, as we've seen before, aren't enjoying the increases in their living standards that they would otherwise have done. So that's a comment. Prediction, it's going to bust. I've not much doubt about it.
But how exactly?
I'll answer that. I learned long ago in economics, an old teacher of mine said, you can give a date and you can give a rate, but never the two together. And sadly, I think with something like this, it is very, very difficult to timings. I think myself, I very much take the point about German history. It's going to be difficult, I think, for Germany to leave, although as those target 2 balances rise and rise and rise, and awareness in Germany increases, I think that's going to have a major political impact. All along, I thought Italy is the vulnerable country because Greece, although it's more extreme and weaker, is small enough, which means it's fudgeable, and also Greece feels it hasn't got very many places to go. And let's face it, Greece has got Turkey on its doorstep. Italy is a much stronger country, serious industries, serious business people. I think it would do extremely well outside the euro. So my prediction is quite simply, Italy will be the first country to leave.
And Mr. Bootle, will that lead to a domino effect, do you think, that also Spain, Portugal, and so on and so forth will leave? Or what is the scenario?
Well, I suspect it will, yes, but not necessarily immediately. How can one tell? After all, Spain, as my charts showed, has done so much better, and that's an interesting question, I think, is why Spain's done so much better than Italy. And I think there won't be quite the same compulsion. Portugal has done nothing like as well, and the Greek issue then comes forward. Then we get the interesting question about France, where political leadership is very weak. I don't think it would happen instantaneously. Surely people would stand back and ask themselves, well, how's Italy doing? And initially, we wouldn't know. But if after a fairly short period of time, Italy, it turns out, is doing well, which is what my suspicion is, then I think there will be a rush for the exit by the weaker countries.
Very interesting. Thank you for your contribution, Mr. Bootle. I would ask a newcomer to join the conversation. Please, sir, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's Stuart Agnew. I'm an MEP. I'm not an economist. I'm simply going to ask a question because I've come here to learn. It's very appropriate. You've just mentioned the expression I was going to use. If or when the euro goes bust. What actually happens then? If a company goes bust, an administrator takes it on, what assets there were distributed amongst the creditors, a few people catch a cold, but life goes on. When a currency goes bust, what actually happens then? What will it be like on the ground? And particularly personally, what will happen to my pension that's going to be paid in euros?
Mr. Grazin is very eager to answer your question.
You know, it's very hard for me to predict, but I've seen it twice in my life. One was in 1989 when the ruble went, and another time when the ruble went in Estonia in 1991. It's very hard to give you a precise answer, but it's unbelievable how many substitute currencies are in real circulation, starting from old gold reserves, whatever they are, plus additionally printed notes, etc., etc. So practically the very same day when it was said that Soviet ruble was not worth anything anymore, the currency was out there next day. You ask what currency? These were the printed cinema tickets that were used as something. From what I make a conclusion, and I thought about Greece, what's going to happen to Greece if they are not able to keep euro in circulation? Our joint answer, who we had been in the Soviet Union at that moment, was that euro is going to be used as a reserve currency in the banks, but they will find some kind of a paper notes that are going to go back into circulation. By the way, in many former Soviet countries, the actual banknotes still exist. The Estonian bank has its banknotes of Estonian currency just in case.
Very good. Sir, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm not MEP, but I'm economist, just to mirror the previous intervention. There is something which strikes me is this debate in terms of Germany versus another country, etc. Actually, it's not Germany versus another country. It's a certain little class within Germany against the German population, and it is the same in each country. Let's take the example of Germany. I'm speaking under your control, of course. I'm French myself. Sorry for...
What is your name again?
Sébastien Cochard. Like Germany, we all know that at the entry of the euro, Germany had internal disinflation, competitive disinflation with the Hartz reform, integration of East Germany, etc. And built on it, we did in a fixed exchange rate within the Eurozone to increase the external account. We all know that. But this do not profit the German citizen. This profits a little class of German UPs and the shareholders of German exporting companies, which are mostly American. So it's not Germany benefiting or not benefiting. It's most like salaries are kept down in Germany very strongly. The investment of the state are reduced to the
And how is that for France, the country you...
The whole idea of Eurozone actually is to impeach the national sovereignty to exercise its action within the domestic framework. Basically, the euro is what? It is, of course, this fixed exchange rate which creates distortions like we see between Germany and the rest of the Eurozone. But the main issue is that it makes totally disappear monetary policy, which is not national, and budgetary policy, because we are all in this straitjacket. So basically, the only thing states can still do is enter into this competitive game to try to be more competitive towards neighbor. And basically, everyone is entering in this system which provides a revenue by exporting to these exporting companies of whom the shareholders are not even European. So basically, it's not countries against country. It's one little class of mondialized, globalized people who are basically vampirizing their whole population.
Very interesting. Thank you for your contribution. Anybody else in the audience? Mr. Starbati, I haven't heard from you quite a while.
Ich wollte auf Ihre Frage.
Well, you've put a very important question. You said, what about my personal situation, my account, my pension? Now, if you're in a country with which has devalue, Greece or Portugal or Italy, for example, then your current salary would shrink because imports have become more expensive. So then you've got a loss of income. Of course, it can be compensated if your country becomes more competitive, as we've seen. For example, your income first of all goes down, but then it goes up again because your economy picks up and becomes more competitive. Now the question is what happens with your pension? If you've invested your money in shares, there's going to be a crash first on the stock market, but that crash will be overcome because the companies then in such a country are they becoming more competitive? Yes, they're becoming more competitive. So shares are going to go up again. If you got your pension through as a pay-as-you-go, then obviously it depends on the state's revenue and tax revenue. If tax revenue goes down, then obviously it's going to impact on your pension. If the tax revenues go up because the country becomes more competitive, then that will have an impact. So you can have a look at then what's happening to the general economy that will pick up. That's what's happening in Germany. They've had to forego revenue. And economics minister talked about social dividends that have gone up because goods have become cheaper. So in these countries, then the actual income is going to go up with imports having got cheaper. What about then pensions? If they're dependent on shares, you have to look at what happens with the shares. If it's a contribution system, you have to look at what happens with tax. Now, as an economist, I cannot give you a well-defined answer. I can just structure the problem for you, and on the basis of that process, I can make assumptions about what's likely to happen. An economist cannot do more unless there are profits. There's only profits in the Bible, I'm afraid.
Jetzt für Professor Meuthen, die andere.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Meuthen, the other professor here.
Ja, ich halte mich ganz bewusst.
Well, I was actually taking back the seat because there's so much expertise around that I felt it was better for me to sit back because everything was going very well. Now, obviously, we all know the motto, 3 experts, 4 opinions. That's what always happens. Well, when Keynes is there, obviously. Personally, I don't think this is such an important question. What's important is that we convey to the people through the member states that quite apart from a currency union, we've actually created a lose-lose situation. That's the only way that people can start to get an inkling about a way out. Now, I agree with Mr. Bootle, the best solution would be that the Germans leave the euro. However, I know someone living there that no one's going to accept that because people have been told again and again that they are benefiting from the euro. They're being told it's good for the exports and that exports would suffer if they were to go back to the Deutschmark, and then they'd have to devalue, and then everyone would be unemployed. This is how Merkel and co have indoctrinated people, and it's been very successful. However, that's just not the approach. I think if it happens, it's not going to be so planned. Now, you've said, do you think it's going to be Italy? Yes, I think it might be Italy. That might be the first. I don't think it's going to be a disaster. What's important is that we finally get rid of this straitjacket. This one currency fits all simply doesn't work. So we've got to somehow get out. And I don't think it matters so much who's going to be the first.
The gentleman in the back of the room. Please introduce yourself briefly and go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Tony Brown. I'm an EFDD political advisor. When I studied British history at university, I was always taught that one of the reasons the British avoided revolution was actually the political will of the elite to avoid it. And you have pretty much all emphasized that the whole of the Eurozone and the whole of the Euro project is created by political will. It's a political project. And then, of course, Mario Draghi famously said, we will do whatever it takes. And for 8, nearly 9 years now, I've worked in the Parliament watching the peoples of Europe, with perhaps a bit of an exception in the case of my own country, absorb everything that is done to them. And I've listened to the logic of everything you've said, but what I'm trying to understand is how and when does the crisis come about which breaks the political will, or doesn't it? And can they carry on, perhaps for decades, to use the popular phrase, kicking the can down the road?
That's quite a question. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Who is willing to give a response to that? Of course, Mr. Starbati. I can always count on you in dark times.
Ja. Man stelle sich vor, die
Imagine the Chinese property bubble blows up. It explodes. You might then say, well, we're going to buy now rather than later. But this would send shock waves through the system to the point where the euro would be affected. Now, individual countries might say, well, look, let's put ourselves first. I cannot see an overall harmonized agreement everyone could sign up to. I think it would be a crash situation, a train crash. Italy, for example, if you leave, then it's a terrible thing. Of course, we know that there are dangers. But there are those who say, give us what we want, and then we'll stay in. And it's a kind of blackmail. And that's the kind of blackmail which takes place against the backdrop of European Monetary Union. Is Greece going to leave? No one can predict. But it does suggest that fragmentation is what the end result is going to be.
Question. I don't think it's quite as simple, though, as saying that for this thing to break, then the politicians, or a group of them, have got to have the will that it should break. Often these things happen, if not quite by accident, with a very major market element in them. I mean, in 1931, the British government did not decide to leave the gold standard. What happened was that the market pressure was enormous, and it already embarked on deflationary policies and didn't have the stomach to do anything else. Similarly, in 1992, again, the British government did not decide to leave the ERM. Indeed, they were saying for some hours after they were out that they still intended to stay in. What happened was, having spent don't know how many billions on the exchanges to try and hold the pound, there wasn't the appetite to spend more. Maybe that's sort of the equivalent of your will, but in a very weak sense. And then they found themselves out. Now, I think there's a parallel here, and again, it relates to Italy. I could imagine circumstances in which, particularly with QE being wound down, there's some point where Italy's in big crisis. The markets have pushed up the Italian bond spreads, and the Italian banking system is very weak. capital flows out of the Italian banking system, target 2 balances going up, and at some point or other the call comes for more help from either Germany itself or the ECB to the Italians, and they don't feel minded to give that support. They don't actually say, right, this is it, we want Italy out. They just can't bring themselves at that point to take that step, which adds to the extra burdens. And then at that point, the Italian government then has to activate the parallel currency. It's got no choice, or the whole banking system goes bust.
So you agree with what Mr. Brown says, that the European elites of countries on the European continent are willing to crash, and the British elites, on the contrary, are avoided these uproars as a result of this?
No, I don't necessarily go that far. I mean, you know, the European elites aren't some devilish creatures, are they? I think they're in the...
Some in the room here might think that is actually true.
They aren't. They're just in the grip, I think, in the grip of some really very awful and profoundly stupid ideas.
Thank you very much. Sir, the word is yours.
Oh, yeah. To continue on the very good explanation of Mr. Boodle, is there's two things. Central banks are not all powerful. At some point, they need to stop, and it's closing. And if you look at the political support for euro in Finland or any other country, it's almost gone. If you're going to ask the Finns that, would you give 50 billion euros to help the suffering of the southern member states, I would say that no. They would probably say that, and that's the thing. We are closing to the point where you cannot sustain the euro anymore.
Yes. Thank you very much. A contribution from Poland by Mr. Wilk is desired.
Thank you very much. I will switch to Polish to express my thoughts maybe better. Szanowni Państwo...
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Polish perspective is obviously a bit different because we don't have the euro. However, the pressure for Poland to accept the euro is bigger every year, and we will soon have to face this dilemma. That's why I'm so very grateful for this discussion. It's a discussion on a completely different level than the discussions we have or we hear in Poland, especially among economists. Because what we hear in Poland is that this argument that if we have the euro, we will be able to travel abroad without changing money, and entrepreneurs will not have to change money either. Of course, this is very childish. I'm very grateful to Mr. Moiten, whom I had the privilege of hosting in the Polish Parliament, where he had a presentation on the euro, which came as a shock to many people. Because we have a propaganda in Poland saying that the euro is great, and these arguments were so obviously contrary to that propaganda. So, yes, this discussion is going on in Poland. The Polish people are against the euro because we have had a stable currency for a very short time, actually. In the 90s even, inflation was very big. The Polish zloty was losing its value from one day to another. And I remember when I was starting work as a young lawyer, my work contract was denominated in dollars, just in case something happened to our currency. So I think the Polish people generally are quite happy with the Polish zloty, with the currency we now have. And everybody's asking about what's going to happen in the future. Well, my inkling is that if we were to adopt the euro, prices will go up. And salaries will go up as well. If salaries go up, then obviously the production costs in Poland will go up as well, and the exports will go down. Poland is at a stage right now where labor cost is competitive. It's still competitive, so this is a great asset of our country. I'm about to finish, yes. So it is obvious to me that the adoption of the euro would be a great surprise to Polish society. According to the treaties, we have committed to adopting the euro at some point, but there is a backdoor because the treaties don't say when this will be done, so we can choose that date. My political party mentions the year 2104. If the EU is still in place then, and if it's not, well, the problem will disappear naturally.
Thank you very much. I have time for one last speaker before I give the chairmanship back to Mr. Moyton. Mr. Grazien, you are very eager to speak, so I'll let you the last word for this discussion.
To correct this thing, we were exactly in the same situation as Poland was, that we were forced to adopt euro according to the treaty, but our counter-argument was that we adopt euro only if Europe itself plays by the euro rules. We did not vote for it, but this is a counter-argument. You are not on the obligation to go euro if Europe does not play by Maastricht rules. First Europe by rules, then Poland by rules, not the other way around.
Thank you very much for those fantastic last remarks. I have been writing down continuously very interesting stuff. I would thank all the contributors to this debate. It was, for me as a journalist, highly educational. Thank you for that. And I want to give back the microphone to Mr. Professor Moyton. Thank you very much.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr Wiersma, für die sehr souveräne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiersma, for having kept the peace there and having held the ring, which is really quite difficult at the end of a long and interesting debate. I think that I can speak on behalf of everyone in saying that we've all learned something this afternoon. I think many of us, well, I have been taking a close interest, University of Cologne, way back to Maastricht, basically. And I have been following these things at a distance since my youth. And today it's clear that we have cast a spotlight on the subject from different vantage points. And I think that parliamentary debates could look at today's debate and have much to be envious of. It really was a very high standard of discussion. I'm glad that we had such a big room. We've had a very good attendance. Everyone has stuck around to the very end. It's a very big subject. And I saw a number of members of the European Parliament this afternoon. There were people from the Eurocritical groups. I think sometimes it's quite difficult. I wished we'd had a few Greens, a few Liberals, others here who might have benefited as well. And I wouldn't want to end proceedings without thanking the organisers who've made this possible. My assistant is sitting there, swivelling in his chair, because this involves a great deal of preparation and spade work. I'd like to thank Mr. Douglas, who has been working away very hard behind the scenes, and again thanks to all of our panelists, our participants, and to everyone who has contributed from the floor. The expert speakers set the scene very well, and that was greatly enriched by the panel discussion with comments from the room. So thanks to one and all. It's all men, it so happens, at the top table for the time being. Can I just finish with an appeal to everyone? Let's keep our eye on the ball, because this is a debate that's not going to go away, and it's not going to remain in aspect. It's going to change. I think that all of us must look and see the signs of change, and this will need to be picked up. The experts have had their say. the politicians will need to run with that ball. And I'd like to thank everyone for being so active and for participating. And safe journey home, everyone.